When Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, the world stood by in terror, as the initial fear was that the capital of Kyiv and then the country might fall in a matter of days. This was due to a variety of factors, including a much smaller military, economy, and less advanced equipment than what the Russian military initially possessed. But Ukraine proved the world wrong. So with all that's happened since then, how do Ukraine and Russia compare with each other now? At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, recently released U.S. intelligence reports estimate that 360,000 Russian troops poured across the border in the early morning hours of February 24, 2022. The most current U.S. estimates of Russian military casualties show that 315,000 of these soldiers are now dead, wounded, captured, or missing. The number of dead is around 120,000. However, even though this astonishing 87% casualty rate among Russia's regular military is staggering, the true extent of Russia's losses is even worse. Even before this became a full-scale war, Russia had been employing private military companies like the Wagner Group and training local militia forces like the DPR and LPR in eastern Ukraine. Since invading the country outright, PMCs and these militias have served alongside regular Russian forces, and their losses are staggering too. The last estimate that came from the Wagner Group, before it dissolved in the wake of the June 2023 uprising, was in the aftermath of the Battle of Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the now deceased leader of the group, claimed that from the start of the invasion to the end of the battle, Wagner lost 22,000 dead and 40,000 wounded. DPR and LPR militias are believed to have suffered a similar amount of casualties from the war's beginning until the present time. For Ukraine, though, their losses are considerably lower. They're still staggering, considering the country has about 5 times fewer people than Russia. U.S. officials estimate that the Ukrainian armed forces have lost a combined total of about 70,000 dead and around 100,000 wounded. These figures are strictly for military casualties, and the death toll for Ukrainian civilians is known with less certainty. It's been confirmed by the United Nations that at least 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed, with about double that figure wounded. However, even the UN admits these figures are likely an underestimation, and the actual civilian casualty count is many magnitudes higher. For example, in regions previously occupied by Russia, like Kharkiv and Chernihiv, Ukrainian police continue documenting previously unknown mass graves. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been murdered in mass slaughter events like this, and it's likely that the graves will continue to be found for years to come. Due to the ferocity and scale of fighting, both Ukraine and Russia have dramatically grown the sizes of their militaries. At the beginning of the war, Russia had about 900,000 personnel in its army and 435,000 in its Navy, Air Force, Border Service, and National Guard. Since the start of the conflict, the number of personnel in Russian service has almost doubled. Currently, the Russian army has around 1.15 million active-duty personnel. There are now about 1 million personnel among Russia's other branches as well. Recently, Putin ordered another 170,000 active-duty soldiers to be added to the overall strength of the Russian army as soon as possible. But how has Russia been able to grow its military strength even as it endures about 15,000 to 20,000 casualties each month? Back in 2022, in the wake of Ukraine's lightning Kharkiv offensive, Putin ordered a partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. What's important about this is not necessarily the fact that he called up 300,000 reservists, but the fact that he has never canceled the order. Because of this, the reservists have now been mobilized for the duration of the war. Despite pleas from Russian families to send their loved ones home, Putin has made it clear these 300,000 soldiers are there to stay until they are dead or the war is over, whichever comes first. In addition to not letting the partially mobilized soldiers go home, Russia has not allowed those called up in the annual conscription cycle to go home either. Russia holds an annual conscription drive that brings in several 100,000 unwilling recruits to its military each year. Since the spring of 2022 conscription cycle, no drafted recruits have been allowed to leave the Russian military. Additionally, those Russian servicemen who have signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense have had their previous contracts nullified, so that the Russian forces can keep them in service past the expiration of their enlistment dates. Additionally, because partial mobilization is still in effect, Russia has raised manpower through what is called crypto mobilization efforts. Because Russia can now issue military summonses electronically, a wider net can now be cast to entrap anyone Russian recruiting officers want, and often they target the most vulnerable people in the country. People arrested for petty crimes, immigrants, ethnic minorities, and dissenters are all prime targets for recruiting officers. Through coercion and threats of violence, it's estimated that Russia drafts about 20,000 men a month into its military, on top of the conscription drives and volunteer enlistments. Because of this, even though Russia might take 20,000 casualties a month, it can still grow its military, since crypto mobilization efforts alone replace those losses. Ukraine has likewise grown its pre-war military much larger than its original size. At the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian army had about 250,000 service members. Its Navy, Air Force, and Territorial Defense Forces had about 150,000 members combined. Presently, the Ukrainian military has about 1 million active-duty personnel, about 800,000 of which are in the Army, 100,000 in Territorial Defense Forces, and 50,000 each in Navy and the Air Force. The initial astronomical growth of the Ukrainian military can mostly be attributed to its volunteer recruitment drives. At the beginning of the war, so many Ukrainians volunteered that some areas, like around Kyiv, ran out of weapons to hand out to people. But as the fighting continued into almost its second full year, volunteer enlistment started becoming augmented by the draft. After the full-scale invasion, President Zelensky put the country under martial law. This has prevented all males aged 18 to 60 who do not possess a valid military exemption from leaving the country. Because of the high casualty rates, Ukraine has started to draft more personnel into its military, since voluntary enlistments have not been enough to compensate for losses. The number of Ukrainian draftees is unknown. However, we do know that Ukrainian squads have a much lower percentage of draftees in them than their Russian counterparts. This could soon change given that top Ukrainian military officials recently presented a proposal to President Zelensky to draft 500,000 more soldiers into the army. As of the making of this video, the plan is yet to be approved, but even with a potential mass mobilization looming in Ukraine, the military still seeks mostly volunteers. However, problems in the military recruitment system have become rampant. Reports from Ukraine have indicated that corruption among recruiting offices has been widespread. It's reportedly common to bribe recruiters and doctors several $1,000s to obtain a so-called white paper that indicates a person is medically unfit for service. The corruption got so bad that President Zelensky fired every regional recruiting office head earlier in 2023. Similarly, it's been noted that at least a minority of Ukrainian men are not interested in fighting and would rather flee. Estimates for the number of able-bodied Ukrainian men who have fled the country rather than fight vary wildly. Some estimates say as few as 20,000 and as many as 650,000 have either bribed their way across the border, snuck across, or gotten phony exemptions and then fled. However, it should be noted that some estimates show around 1 million Russian men fled their own country after the partial mobilization occurred. Russia has also been forcing society at large to be prisoners within Russia, mostly by seizing the passports of military-aged men and setting up recruiting offices at border checkpoints. Overall, Russia, and to a lesser extent Ukraine, have had to resort to more drastic force-generation efforts to continue absorbing casualties at the rate they've been taking while still holding their current positions. Besides the human losses, the loss of equipment on both sides has been astronomical since the beginning of the invasion, starting with the Russian army, which has lost almost 14,000 pieces of equipment, including over 2,500 tanks and approximately 4,300 armored fighting vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles. Additionally, the Russian Air Force has lost around 96 fixed-wing aircraft and 133 helicopters. However, it should be noted that both for armed vehicles and aircraft, Russia has lost a disproportionate number of newer and more advanced systems that are being replaced by legacy Soviet equipment. For example, the vast majority of the T-72s Russia upgraded during its past decade have been destroyed. These tanks were among the best in Russia's arsenal since they had better night sights, increased armor protection, and a more robust communication suite than the older T-72 models. Because of this, Russia has been forced to bring more tanks out of storage to replace them. However, records show that after decades of graft and theft in the Soviet military, most tank depots have only around 10 to 30% of the stored vehicles actually being serviceable. The Russian Air Force has also lost a ton of its newer aircraft, including the very capable Su-34. To date, Ukraine's destroyed around 17% of the roughly 148 of these aircraft that Russia possesses. The losses of advanced equipment, such as the Su-34, cannot be understated. This is because of the crushing sanctions Russia has faced worldwide. Advanced avionics and other aircraft parts needed to create more Su-34 aircraft are unavailable. This means that what Russia has is what they're stuck with, and each loss of an airframe is irrecoverable. Of course, Russia may try to produce more aircraft, but these will undoubtedly be of a lesser quality than what they made in the past and will end up suffering higher losses than before. The Russian Navy's not been immune to horrific losses either. Since the start of the invasion, The Russian Navy has lost a heavy cruiser, a submarine, a corvette, 4 large amphibious ships, and numerous smaller vessels. These losses are more significant because they were lost against a country without a navy. Each of these losses was inflicted either through cruise missiles or remote-operated drones. Even though Ukraine has been dishing out some serious damage to Russia, it has not been immune from losses itself. Roughly speaking, Ukraine has about a third of the documented losses across all of its systems, except for its Air Force and Navy, which have suffered disproportionate losses. For example, Ukraine has lost 77 combat aircraft since the start of the war. However, with an Air Force that was about the 10th of the size of Russia at the beginning, these losses are felt much harder than Russia. Thankfully, Ukraine has received donations of Soviet aircraft from NATO countries looking to free up space for newer Western aircraft like the F-35. But even though Ukraine has lost a very high number of aircraft, the fact that the Ukrainian Air Force is still a combat-effective force after almost 2 years of high-intensity conflict is a testament to the resolution and ingenuity of Ukraine to keep this combat arm alive. As far as the Ukrainian Navy, what remained of it was mostly wiped out in the opening weeks of the invasion. After Russia illegally invaded Crimea back in 2014, the bulk of the Ukrainian Navy was seized. Russia gave back a few older ships and kept the newer ones for themselves. With most of its surface fleet lost, Ukraine reconstituted it around the last remaining large surface combatant, an older Soviet frigate, and a small fleet of coastal patrol vessels. Within weeks of the opening salvos, Russia captured or destroyed most of these vessels, while Ukrainian sailors scuttled their flagship when it appeared Mykolaiv might fail. However, despite these losses, the US and UK have already started rebuilding Ukraine's navy through donations of patrol vessels, Coast Guard cutters, and minesweepers. Though some of these vessels have not been delivered yet, with Ukraine regaining control over most of the Black Sea, these security guarantees will help rebuild a new Ukrainian navy. Speaking of security guarantees, though both sides have lost a ton of equipment, there have been a few gains for both. Starting with Russia, despite losing most of its ability to build complex weapon systems like missiles, aircraft, tanks, and ships, it has invested in other weapon systems to give it an edge on the battlefield. One of these main systems it appears Russia has an edge over Ukraine in is its electronic warfare systems. Due to the proliferation of drones and Western-provided GPS-guided munitions, Russia's realized it cannot have any hope of surviving, much less winning this war, without advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Details remain scarce from the battlefield, but there have been increasing numbers of reports that Russia now has about 1 electronic warfare system for every 10 kilometers on the front line. These systems are not only numerous but have started to have an impact on the battlefield. Ukrainian commanders report that these systems are destroying large numbers of unsophisticated drones, hampering communications, and causing increasing numbers of HIMARS rockets and Excalibur artillery shells to miss their targets. In addition to Russia's increased electronic warfare prowess, it's also blanketed Ukraine's skies with mass-produced Shahed suicide drones. These Iranian-designed one-way attack drones are meant to destroy targets at a fraction of the cost of an expensive cruise missile. Russia also has been employing large numbers of Shahed drones to both overwhelm and confuse Ukrainian air defense networks so that cruise missiles can successfully hit their targets. The main reason why Russia has so many Shahed drones is because it's maintained a loose alliance with Iran and North Korea to prop up its defense industrial base. Due to Russia having a very weak defense industrial base that is rife with corruption, inefficiency, as well as starvation of Western parts, it struggled to keep up with demand for even the most basic military items like artillery shells. Because of this, it's not clear what exactly Russia has promised these two countries, but Russia likely is currently or will at some point in the near future trade state secrets for aircraft, missiles, and potential nuclear technology with Iran and North Korea in exchange for arms. Since 2022, both countries have been supplying Russia with huge quantities of ammunition and materials. With Russia expending up to 80,000 artillery shells a day in Ukraine, Iran and North Korea have sent millions of rounds of artillery ammunition Russia simply could not produce. They've also sent huge stockpiles of ammunition of all types and calibers. We don't know the extent of their cooperation with Russia, but we do know it is extensive. Both countries routinely send shipments via the Caspian Sea or through the Black Sea on merchant ships with false manifests. North Korea also has been sending huge convoys of trains throughout 2023 that have helped replenish Russian ammunition stocks during critical moments of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Iran's also helped set up a drone-producing factory in Russia itself. Because Russia was purchasing more Shaheds than Iran could produce, with Iranian help they set up a drone factory in central Russia to produce the drones Putin wanted so dearly. It's also been documented that Iran has sent trainers to occupied Crimea to train Russian soldiers on how to fly the Shahed drones. But even with Russia's new axis of evil behind them, the capabilities that it's achieved in the past 2 years do not come anywhere close to what the arsenal of democracy can provide. Thanks to generous donations from the US and 46 other countries, the Ukrainian military is stronger now than it has ever been before. The amount of military aid provided to Ukraine has been vast, with over $75 billion in just military assistance provided to date. Western aid alone equated to about half of what Russia spent on defense in 2022 and 2023. However, despite Russia's increasing reliance on outdated systems, Ukraine's military has enjoyed the best weaponry Western money can buy. The sheer quantity of military aid delivered to Ukraine has been staggering. Besides the huge volumes of Soviet equipment that NATO countries have donated to clear space in their armories and supply Ukraine with what it needed until more advanced systems could arrive, the country's gotten huge upgrades in every aspect of its military. Ukraine has received literal mountains of ammunition with hundreds of millions of small arms rounds, millions of artillery and mortar shells, and hundreds of thousands of missiles and rockets. Ukraine's been gifted approximately 3 armored brigades worth of modern Western armored vehicles and tanks. The country's received huge donations of some of the best anti-air defense systems, like the Patriot, Iris-T, Gepard, NASAMS, Starstreak, and Stinger. With this huge influx of modern systems, along with gifting what remained of legacy Soviet systems in free Europe, Ukraine now has the most robust air defense network in the world. With this amazing capability that combines short, medium, and long ranges with fixed, portable, and man-capable systems, the Ukrainian military has become the most battle-hardened air defense soldiers in modern history. With success rates frequently above 90% against Russian air, missile, and drone attacks, the Ukrainian military has not only been provided with this equipment, but has shown they are incredibly adept at using it. Despite the huge influx of Western aid that has provided everything from food, fuel, uniforms, and first aid kits, to tanks and missile systems to Ukraine, the country has not just been standing by and holding out its hand, waiting for the next aid package. Ukraine has been actively taking steps to become more self-sufficient in its defense. Among these steps include blanketing the skies over Ukraine with drones. Because Ukraine's air force has always been on the back foot, Ukrainian military leaders knew they had to come up with a way to deny Russia air supremacy and still maintain a contested airspace. They've done this through the proliferation of both armed and unarmed drones. Dotted across countless areas of Ukraine are drone manufacturing facilities. These are often rudimentary places that have taken up residence in once peaceful civilian areas, now reduced to rubble by Russian attack. Inside these workshops are civilians and soldiers working 24 hours a day to manufacture homemade drones or reconfigure commercially available drones. By making some small adjustments to some outdated Soviet hand grenades, one of these factories can produce a tank killing machine for less than $100. Combine these homemade drones with tens of thousands of commercial drones the Ukraine buys every year, and you can quickly see why drones are becoming one of the main weapons in this war. Beyond just taking out soldiers and vehicles with grenade attacks, Ukraine relies on drones for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and even mine hunting. With the ability to operate at all hours of the day, Ukraine's drone warfare has been instrumental in keeping Russian forces off balance. Ukraine has not only invested in airborne drones, it's created its own seaborne drones that have revolutionized naval warfare. While the Houthis have used sea drones in the past, these single-vehicle assaults on lone warships paled in comparison to the coordinated long-distance and multi-axis attacks Ukraine conducted against the Russian Black Sea Fleet ships in Sevastopol and across the Black Sea. These drone attacks help make up for the lack of Ukrainian Navy and are one of the reasons why Ukraine is beating Russia in the Black Sea. Besides drones, Ukraine's also produced its own robust system of counter-battery radar. Whenever an artillery piece fires, a series of radars can use math to triangulate accurately where the shots came from and return fire. Ukraine's artillery is incredibly accurate due to having to conserve ammunition, and one of the main reasons for their accuracy is the success of their own counter-battery radars. In fact, Ukraine is so good at destroying Russian artillery in counter-battery fire while limiting Russia's own progress in this area that several high-ranking Russian commanders were sacked when they questioned the Kremlin about why Russia was getting beat in this field. So even though Ukraine has struggled to combat Russian electronic warfare capabilities, mostly due to Western laws that prevent this kind of technology from being exported, they have been soundly beating Russia in its artillery duel. This leads us to our next comparison of strategic changes in the war. When the war first broke out, it was characterized as a war of movement. Think of long columns of Russian tanks headed straight for Kyiv, the battle for Hostomel Airport, where Russian air assault troops tried to take it to land more infantry forces, or the rapid advance across southern Ukraine that led to the siege of Mariupol. During those chaotic first few months, Ukraine was at its weakest militarily, and its only goal was to survive. At the time, Russia's strategic goal was a quick occupation of Kyiv, the decapitation of Ukrainian leadership, and the dissolution of the Ukrainian state. It was thanks to the steadfastness of the Ukrainian people who volunteered in such masses that they ran out of guns before they ran out of volunteers that Russia was stopped in its tracks. In the moments that followed the initial invasion, Ukraine fought back against the stunned, demoralized, incompetent, and overextended Russian forces. Throughout the course of 2022, they retook northern Ukraine, Kharkiv Oblast, and all of Kherson Oblast west of the Dnipro River. Numerically, Ukraine's forces decreased Russia's hold on its territory from a high of 27% to around 18% of the country it currently controls. In the wake of these offensives, Russia had to have some sort of victory in the information space, so it did one of the things it does each presidential election. It held sham elections. During these sham elections, Russian officials claimed that Ukrainians overwhelmingly voted to become part of Russia. What Russia did not tell its people as well is that it only controlled about half of the claimed territory it just tried to annex. They also did not report the fact that Ukrainians who did not vote would be forced out of their homes, drafted by the military, arrested, or denied medical care. But to Russia, a win is a win. For Ukraine's part, President Zelensky officially applied for NATO membership. Over the next 12 months, NATO countries have all agreed that Ukraine will become part of NATO in the future. However, what steps Ukraine must take and when that would happen are still a hotly debated topic among alliance members. What's known, though, is that the overall campaign has been a strategic failure for Putin. Russia was unable to eliminate the Ukrainian state or kill its leadership. Russia's three-day war is nearing its 700th day, and most of Russia's pre-war professional military lies wasting away in Ukrainian fields, providing ample fertilizer for the country's beautiful sunflowers. So, with all that being said, what's next? Due to the overall lackluster results of Ukraine's much-anticipated summer counteroffensive, Western leaders, especially U.S. Republicans, but others in Europe, like leadership in Hungary, are starting to question how much aid they'll continue to provide to Ukraine. While U.S. and EU lawmakers block tens of billions of dollars in military and economic aid to Ukraine, Russia has redefined what winning looks like in this conflict. For Russia, they no longer have a hope of a military decapitation of Ukraine. Instead, they're trying to set conditions for a protracted forever war in the country with the hope of the West losing interest. This is already playing out in the current Russian offensive around Avdiivka. Since October 2023, the Russian army has been trying to encircle entrenched Ukrainian defenders around the city of Avdiivka. The Avdiivka salient is a crucial part of Ukraine's defense in the Donbas, as controlling it helps maintain containment of Donetsk city, the rebel capital of eastern Ukraine, since 2014. Russian forces have carried out basically suicidal attacks against Ukraine at the cost of heavy casualties, both in terms of personnel and material, for little gain. Many experts speculate that the reason for Russia's continued assaults in the area, despite little preparation and no strategy, is that the end goal is to throw Ukraine off balance and help kill Western support for the country. Ukraine, for its long-term strategic goals, remains the same. Its leadership has continued stating that Ukraine will not negotiate with Russia and that the only solution to end the war is the liberation of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. Ukraine's also been carrying out long-range attacks against Crimea using Storm Shadow and other donated long-range missiles, as well as drones. Ukraine has also attacked the Kerch Strait Bridge several times, and some of Ukraine's most daring attacks in Crimea were its cruise missile strikes on ships in Port Sevastopol and blowing up a meeting of high-ranking Black Sea Fleet officers at their headquarters. Overall, Ukraine's campaign to isolate Crimea has been working. Russia has moved the bulk of the Black Sea Fleet away from Crimea and home-ported it in Russian waters. This move has removed most missile threats coming from the Black Sea toward Ukraine. Russia's also so worried about its supply situation in Crimea due to the Kerch Bridge attacks that they have limited the bridge to military-only traffic, forcing civilian vehicles to board Russian amphibious landing ships or ferries to cross the strait. Ukraine's also continuing to maintain a foothold on the east bank of the Dnipro River in southern Kherson Oblast. Over the past several months, Ukraine has landed forces at several points in Kherson Oblast, just over the river from Kherson City itself. Despite Russia committing huge reserves of manpower and resources, tens of thousands of Russian troops cannot dislodge several thousand Ukrainians from the area. Though the combat in this sector is not a war of movement, Ukraine has been setting conditions with HIMARS strikes and artillery that have taken out reinforcements and supply depots. The inability of Russian troops to dislodge Ukrainian forces so enraged one Russian general in the sector that when he advanced to see what was going on for himself, he was killed by a mine laid by his own troops. In addition to continued battlefield successes, though Ukraine may not outlast Russia regarding manpower, it will beat them out in combat capability. For example, the Russian Air Force conducted about 60 sorties a day during peacetime. At the height of the air war, they were conducting 200 sorties a day. Now they only conduct about 100 sorties a day. One of the main reasons for this is that Ukraine not only has the world's best air defense network, but Russia lacks the money and capability to perform adequate maintenance on its airframes, as well as deconflicting the battle space to prevent friendly fire incidents. On average, Russia's losing about 40 airframes a year due to combat losses. Another 10 airframes are being lost a year to breaking down in flight from maintenance issues or being shot down by friendly fire incidents. Despite these horrendous losses, Russia's estimated to lose about 30 more aircraft a year due to maxing out the recommended number of flight hours on its airframes. Of course, this probably wouldn't stop Russia from flying the aircraft, but that just means Russian combat aviation will continue suffering higher numbers of destroyed aircraft due to catastrophic failures in flight. This is in stark contrast to Ukraine, which is slated to receive a whole new fleet of F-16 fighter jets with the best maintenance and parts support in the world. As far as what the future of the conflict holds, it appears to be more of a stalemate. The war is no longer a war of movement. After the disastrous 2022 campaign, Russia's only objective for that year was to not lose any more ground in Ukraine. They did this by creating the Surovikin Line in Ukraine. The Surovikin Line is the three-tiered defensive belt ringing Ukraine's front line from Kherson to Luhansk. This line has 3 trench systems where the first line of defenses are placed convict soldiers, conscripts, DPR and LPR forces, and PMC fighters from companies like Redoubt, the PMC that took Wagner's place, and are meant to be disposable units that if they hold, great, but it's not a great loss to Russia. The second line is the main effort with the best infantry in the area that's ready for combat. The third line is the reserve trenches, usually held by more conscripts or professional units being refitted. The front of the first and second lines of defense are the most extensive mine belts in the world. These mine belts are several kilometers thick and stretch the country's entire length. Essentially, the Russian military has created a sort of demilitarized zone that Ukraine must push through, hence the lackluster progress this past summer. Due to this line of fortifications, the war has turned into an artillery and drone duel. While soldiers sit opposite in their trenches, they're under constant artillery bombardment, with thousands of drones from both sides scouring overhead looking for targets. If Ukraine wants to retake its territory in 2024 or beyond, it has to come up with a strategy to break the stalemate and punch through the Surovikin Line. Until then, both sides might continue to replenish losses at their current rate, but not bring in enough of an edge to make significant territorial gains either way. Now check out how Ukraine war is reshaping US military, or watch this video instead.